Good morning. Barry Bryson coming to you again with 5 good minutes in the Word. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm here at the guest room of the manse and not from my office today. Today we're talking about Paul's sermons in the book of Acts. Before we do, we need to remember when Paul is preaching. Paul is living and working in the first century, which is in the middle of the Pax Romana, that period of unprecedented peace and prosperity between AD 20 and AD 180 that the Mediterranean world enjoys because of Roman hegemony at the time. And so he's able to move around, travel, and to make a living in a way he might not have been a century earlier or 2 centuries later. The Apostle Paul, during this time, has received the broadest possible education and training. Even before he became a Christian, he has technical training. He's a tent maker. He can make things like tents and awnings and things that are in high demand with the military and with merchants. He can go into any town and rent some space and support himself as a missionary in that town. He also has the best possible rabbinic Jewish training available at the time, something that he mentions several times in his writings. But in Acts chapter 22, we find out that he was trained by the great Gamaliel, who was perhaps one of the greatest rabbinic minds of all time, and the grandson of the great Hillel. This is the man who spoke sense when Peter and John were tried before the Sanhedrin, and one imagines that Paul himself might even have been in the room when that happened. He also has received, as we can tell from his facility with Stoic philosophy, Neoplatonist philosophy, and Greek and Roman authors, many of them, received a great classical education, which serves him well in these sermons. The first sermon that Paul preaches is recorded in Acts chapter 13. And before we look at that, we have to remember that Paul was there when Stephen died. Stephen was stoned, was a victim of mob violence, and Paul was there to give quasi-authority, the authority of the Sanhedrin, as a representative of the Sanhedrin there when Stephen was stoned. And Stephen's sermon, which was a quite brilliant sermon, was to tell a history lesson of God's people and to put Jesus in context as the culmination of everything God was working towards. But he never got to finish that sermon because he was stoned before he was able to finish it. And Paul was there that day. And when Paul finally preaches his long sermon in Acts chapter 13, in a very sweet piece of irony, he finishes the sermon that Stephen never got to finish. He does exactly the same thing that Stephen does. And he ends by saying, "We preach to you the good news of the promise made to the fathers, that God has fulfilled this promise to our children and that he raised up Jesus. As it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you." Paul's first sermon displays his great rabbinic training, but it also allows him to finish the sermon that he helped to end that day when Stephen was martyred. The second long sermon that Paul preaches in Acts chapter 17, and here his classical training is on full display. He's in Athens. He's on the Areopagus, Mars Hill, where the greatest minds of the day would meet to discuss and debate. And he's brought there because they want to hear what he has to say. And he preaches to them not from the Old Testament, but from Stoic philosophy, Neoplatonist philosophy. From their writers, he quotes Epimenides, he quotes Menander, and he preaches Jesus Christ. He tells them about the God they don't know yet, the God who brings about the resurrection of the dead. A lot of commentators will say this sermon was not successful. But at the end of this, several people follow Paul, and he's made at least 2 converts, which are more responses than I usually get on a Sunday morning. So I do think, given the context, this is a wildly successful sermon. I also want us to think about Paul's defense before King Agrippa in Acts chapter 26. This is a classic example and perhaps the best example of forensic rhetoric. Paul making his defense, which is a staple in Greek and Roman literature from Socrates through Cicero. And he strikes the pose, even though his hands are in chains, and he starts to make his defense before King Agrippa, a man who has a similar education to Paul, both in Jewish teaching and in Greek and Roman philosophy. And he's susceptible to Paul's story. And it's interesting because before the end of the sermon, Paul himself has become the interrogator, saying to King Agrippa, "You believe the prophets. I know you do." And then he says something that in Greek is not a coherent sentence. You think, in a little, make me a Christian. He didn't convert Agrippa that day, but he got to him. And he will get to us too. He will speak to our hearts and our minds, no matter what our background is. God prepared him for this task. So I encourage you to read Paul's sermons in the book of Acts and to listen to them as for the first time. Thank you for joining me for 5 Good Minutes with the Word. On Monday, we'll introduce the book of Romans.